Welcome, everyone. My name is Brad Crabtree, Director of the Carbon Capture Coalition. Thank you for joining us today for a conversation on why industrial carbon capture and removal must be a central part of any climate strategy. We have had over 300 people register for this event, which underscores the growing interest in this topic. The Carbon Capture Coalition is a partnership of more than 80 companies, unions, and NGOs, all working together to build federal policy support for economy-wide deployment of carbon capture, transport, removal, and storage. We believe that carbon capture is an essential technology to meet mid-century climate goals, foster domestic industrial production, and support high-wage jobs. We are here today because industrial production is central to modern life and prosperity, providing cement, steel, and basic chemicals, but also responsible for approximately 30% of both global and domestic carbon emissions. The challenge before us is immense. Without further action, we could see a 50% increase in industrial sector emissions by mid-century. Over the next 40 years, the world will build a New York City's worth of infrastructure each month. Industry is hard to decarbonize and will require a portfolio of solutions, carbon capture and direct air capture notably among them. During today's conversation, we'll hear from leaders of companies and organizations that are putting carbon capture front and center as a climate strategy. We're thrilled to have such a stellar panel with us today. Now I'll hand things over to our moderator, Akshat Ratti. Akshat is a reporter at Bloomberg Environment and one of the leading journalists on this topic in the world. We're very fortunate to have him here today. Thank you, Akshat.
Thanks, Brad. It's good to be here. Commercial scale carbon capture technology is almost as old as commercial solar power. In 2020, we don't have webinars talking about why solar power is a necessary climate strategy, but we do have them for carbon capture technology. That in a nutshell explains the status of the debate surrounding this technology. In 2017, I spent a year trying to understand why that's the case. And in the series I published, the most intriguing use of the technology was in the industrial sector, where there are very few affordable alternatives to cutting emissions, or sometimes no alternatives. To discuss the technology and the development since 2017, there has been a lot that has happened, especially in the US. The US has been and remains the leading user of carbon capture technology, and through a number of legal laws that were passed, you have access to tax credits, which have proven to be the key method through which clean energy technologies can be scaled up. One of those tax credits are now applicable to the use of carbon capture technology. And what can happen in the next few years could determine whether this technology scales up as the world needs it. To discuss that, we have a stellar panel with us today. We have Jamie Gentoso, who's the CEO of the US operations of LafargeHolcim, which is the world's largest cement maker. Steve Oldham, who is the CEO of Carbon Engineering, a leading direct air capture company. Colin O'Mara, who is the president and CEO of National Wildlife Federation, the US's largest private nonprofit conservation group, and Brad Markell, who is the executive director of AFL-CIO, the largest federation of unions in the US, representing more than 12.5 million active and retired workers. Instead of having opening remarks, I'm going to start out by asking a question, which I'm hoping our panelists would sort of lay out the case for why carbon capture either is crucial for their work or overlaps with the work that they do. And I'll start with Jamie. As I said, the technology is mature and exists. So why is there not a single cement plant in the world that has scaled up carbon capture technology?
Very good question, and thank you for having me today. So I think first, there's a couple different reasons. I think first, a lot of the carbon capture technology has been built around power plants, right? So the emissions that come from the burning of coal. And at cement plants, we also can use coal or pet coke But we use our main raw materials are typically, mined from the earth. So limestone is one of them. We use clays and other types of materials like that. So our flue gases are very different. So the technology needs to be modified for use on a cement plant. So that is probably the biggest reason. The second really is that there's not a market right now for carbon capture. So there has not been a lot of work in R&D that has been done in carbon capture technology to make it so that it can be done in scale as well as economically. So those are the two big reasons that I see. At LafargeHolcim, we are really good at making cement. It's what we do, but we are just learning how to capture carbon. So we actually are in a partnership, and I think the way that it'll happen as we move forward is, developing these partnerships with companies that have really great technology. So we're working with Svante at our plant in Florence, Colorado. They have great carbon capture technology. And then we're working with Total and Oxy, who have expertise in compression and transmission and reuse. So through this partnerships or further partnerships is where I really think that we will get there. Also, the Department of Energy has recently supported the project that we have going on right now, and with some funding, some grant funding that'll help us further this project and keep it going, and eventually we will be capturing carbon there. So it's fundamental for us that we have the ability to continue to move forward with this, because if we don't, if this technology is not developed, it'll be very difficult, or if not impossible, for the cement industry to fully decarbonize.
And just as a follow-up, very recently, LafargeHolcim put out a plan to lower the emissions tied to per ton of cement produced. And in my conversations with the Chief Sustainability Officer, I was told that LafargeHolcim will have their first net zero cement plant, which will have obviously carbon capture installed on it, up and running by 2030. So among the two projects you mentioned, and I understand there are 3 other projects around the globe, is this through a competition between these projects as to which one is going to be the most economically feasible, that you're going to decide which one gets to be the first?
Yes, it's absolutely a competition amongst us. So we have this plant here that we're working toward in Florence, Colorado, and we hope to have another one that will vie for to be the net zero plant that we have developed in LafargeHolcim.
Great, thanks. Steve, I wanted to understand, we've not introduced, I suppose, the technology that your company works on. So let me just briefly say what that is. Most of the conversation we have around carbon capture technology is tied to what is known as capturing emissions from point sources. So that may be either, as Jamie said, a power plant or a cement plant, or it could be a steel plant. But in the world we find ourselves, to meet the goals under the Paris Climate Agreement, there is a whole other suite of technologies called negative emissions technologies that are likely to be required, or probably definitely required in the second half of the century. And one of those is direct air capture, where instead of capturing emissions from a point source, you capture it directly from the air. But the physics of it dictates that when you have a more dilute source of carbon dioxide, the costs are typically higher. And yet, direct air capture companies, including Steve's company, Carbon Engineering, are forging ahead. So my question to you, Steve, is, as I said, the world doesn't need carbon capture or direct air capture until after mid-century for most of the climate targets that we are trying to reach. Why are you building now and raising so much money at it?
So first of all, good morning, good afternoon to everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to talk. So fundamentally, you have to look at the value proposition of what direct air capture does, in my opinion. So point source capture is fantastic, and there will be sources of CO2 that are high concentration and hence allow us to take the low-hanging fruit of reducing our CO2 emissions that way. But there are many, 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 many different types of CO2 emissions. And the challenge with point source is you have to capture, and then you have to take that CO2 from wherever you captured to wherever you're going to dispose of it or bury it or permanently secure it. So it requires pipelines from every emitter to every source of sequestration. Similarly, if your sources of emissions are mobile, for example, transportation, it's infeasible that we put a carbon collector on the back of everybody's truck or plane or ship, even if we successfully convert to all electric cars. So what direct air capture does for you, it allows you to eliminate any emission of any type from any place on the earth, but also from any moment in time. So it's fantastic that we're doing point source capture to stop today's emissions and tomorrow's emissions, but what about yesterday's and the day before? So that's the value proposition of direct air capture. So why do it now? Why invest money into it now? So I would always push back on the assertion that, hey, we don't need this today. That's based upon some calculation or model of an expected take-up rate of carbon emission reduction. If we can't achieve that model, the problem gets worse and worse and worse with every single passing day. So you want your solutions that can address a ubiquitous way of capturing CO2 to deal with any emission. You want those ready, and you also want them dropping down the cost curve. So the plant behind me is the one that we're building with Occidental and 1.5 in the Permian Basin. It's going to capture a megaton of CO2 per year. It's expensive. It's the first of a kind. The first solar plant was expensive. The first electric car was expensive. But the reason those technologies are cheap today is because we drove down the cost curve by fielding them. So I think we need at a policy level to be encouraging and driving the adoption of technologies that are ubiquitous, can solve any emission. And then secondly, if this technology is going to play a part in the future, no better time to start doing your R&D and your deployment than today. Only better time was yesterday. So that's why we're driving hard on bringing direct air capture to feasibility and showing that it's available and affordable.
And again, a quick follow-up here. One of the trends that we've seen this year is the point you were making about historical emissions, or as some people call it, the carbon debt. And some companies are starting to take responsibility for it. So we know that Microsoft has announced that it's going to erase its emissions from when it was created. Google says it's already done it through the use of offsets. And then there's a little known company, but here in Europe is popular for making windows called Velux, which is also going to do it, which is probably older than either Microsoft or Google. Have you seen some of that money come to you? Because yours is one of the companies that can provide that historical reduction in emissions if companies want to pursue it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's great that companies are looking at their historical and legacy CO2 footprints as well as they're going forward. It's not widely understood by everybody, but the amount of CO2 causing our climate problem, the vast majority of it is already in the atmosphere. So we have to deal with legacy emissions as well as dealing with our emissions going forward. So the companies that you mentioned, they are absolutely driving on looking at negative emissions, eliminating their prior footprints. We're in discussions with all of them except the European one and others. We just had Shopify, which is Canada's most valuable company, announce an agreement with Carbon Engineering, excuse me, to buy carbon offsets from us. The one thing I would say is what matters here is the permanence. What sequestration allows you to do is permanently, safely, and accountably put your CO2 back underground again. Some of the offset schemes that are being looked at for negative emissions don't provide you that permanence and don't provide you with that exact measure of accountability. So what we're seeking to do with our technology, we measure our CO2 when it goes underground. It's buried deep in the geological formations that the carbon came from in the first place to create the challenge that we have, and it stays there forever.
Great, thank you. Now, Colin, we're talking about industrial emissions today. Why does a wildlife organization care?
I mean, the science is pretty clear at this point. I mean, we need to figure out a way to get to net zero emissions. And unfortunately, most of the debate around carbon capture technologies has really been limited to the power sector. But, when I'm looking at the, 20% plus of emissions coming from, the industrial sector, and wanting to maintain both U.S. production capacity, and frankly having more domestic manufacturing would be my preference, because I'm tired of offshoring jobs to other parts of the country, and the need to have cleaner products and cleaner processes. There's really no way to get there without having these industrial kind of carbon capture technologies come to scale. And so, whether we're talking about the big four of steel and iron, and looking at petrochemicals and chemical processes and plastics, or looking at aluminum, or we're looking at paper, or we're looking at the other major sources of emission, cement, of course. We need to have the policy structure in place, and frankly, in some cases, a direct investment to try to make these technologies the standard of American production, and hopefully production around the globe. I don't want to be in a world where we have a regulatory regime where basically we offshore this kind of production until those emissions are happening. They're not happening on our shore, but they're still happening somewhere else in the country that has lower standards. And so, for me, from a wildlife organization, a conservation organization, we are all in to be extremely pragmatic to get to net zero emissions as quickly as humanly possible. And at the same time, I want to have a more robust, American economy that has a lot more manufacturing jobs, has a lot more, middle-class jobs that folks can aspire to and fill. Hopefully a lot of that will be organized. And the only way to do that is to have these technologies get to scale. And the last thing that I'll just add is that as we're thinking about these types of investment, we have other countries around the world subsidizing industrial production. You think about the investment the China Development Bank has been making for years, undercutting capital costs. We have traditionally we've basically put a lot of those regulatory costs on these entities in the U.S. that are being asked to compete. So an organization like mine that can come in and try to make the case for why there's a societal good to making investments and make these companies more competitive, make these technologies cleaner, is frankly something that has to happen. And the idea that the private sector alone can solely bear the cost of these upgrades, I think just doesn't match the reality of the need to get to the emission reductions as quickly as possible if we're going to stave off the worst climate impacts. And obviously we're seeing worse impacts, by the day here. And so these technologies can't get deployed fast enough.
And as a short follow-up, there is a UN Biodiversity Summit happening tomorrow. And do you think enough of the people in your world are aware of the technology, are engaged with it, or frankly would make the same points that you have made in response to that question?
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question. I think the industrial sector as a whole has received so little attention that it's actually holding back our ability to make progress globally. And look, I don't want to bore your audience, but right now about 1/3 of all species are at heightened risk of extinction. There's about 1 million species we're concerned of kind of across the globe of having a heightened likelihood of extinction in the coming decades. And frankly, being better stewards of resources, doing a better job, recycling materials, doing a better job, capturing emissions. Again, not just carbon, but criteria pollutants as well, advances all of those goals. But, unfortunately, and I think the U.S. is partially to blame for this, is that the predominance of focus has been on the power sector, been a little bit more recently on the transportation sector, but we haven't spent nearly enough time, not just industrial, but also agriculture and kind of natural solutions. And I think, this is why we're so proud of our work with the Carbon Capture Coalition, because I do think elevating these technologies in the industrial space at a moment when folks are frankly tired of having everything coming from China and other countries, when a lot of that could be manufactured here, if we were had slightly more competitive structures to allow that to happen, is exactly the right time to elevate the industrial solutions conversation in this bigger climate and biodiversity conversation.
Thanks. And Brad, carbon capture plants don't typically employ a lot of people. I think there's just this general movement towards automation in industry. Why does the AFL-CIO care about this technology when perhaps jobs are not its strong suit, even if carbon reduction might be?
Well, thanks, Ashcott, and thanks for the Carbon Capture Coalition for inviting us up. I'm not sure that premise is right on a couple of counts, on the jobs numbers, but also on account of what the labor movement is, right? It's a broadly progressive movement that cares a lot about a lot of things, like immigration, like race, and so on. But on the jobs front, look, some of the figures are starting to come out. There's good job creation in carbon capture. There's a very, very robust supply chain that involves all kinds of highly engineered products. The construction jobs are what you'd expect from any highly capital intensive system. The operations jobs are pretty good. They're in the industrial setting. They're additional to the jobs at the particular facility. So it really, the jobs are what the jobs are. It's a job of the future that we want to have here, and we want to make sure that they're good, high-paid union jobs. But more than that, what carbon capture does to preserve and grow jobs in sectors that are important to the labor movement, in the cement sector, in steel, in fuel and production, of course, in the power sector. Those all link to the production of fuels, the transportation of fuels, the use of steel in fuel production. It's all very, very important to the labor movement. If we don't have carbon capture technology that's mature and is cost competitive, in a decarbonized future, the jobs we have in all kinds of industries are at risk. So we see this as an investment in growing in the jobs of the future and preserving the jobs we have. I think the second piece is what Colin said around competition. If we don't have carbon capture technology that's cost effective for industrial applications, yet we want to decarbonize our economy in the United States, we're just going to push jobs offshore where they won't be regulated, where there will be pollution. Carbon pollution is global, as you all know, but criteria pollutants will just be pushed offshore. And so it's really, really important that we get carbon capture technology commercialized in the United States. And then, as everybody said, it's a good way to reduce emissions and to beat the worst effects of climate change.
And as a follow-up, it's a strange time in the US where there's, pretty clear indication if you care about the environment, you have one candidate. If you, or specifically climate change, you have one candidate. And if you don't, then you have one candidate. Carbon capture, interestingly, does have bipartisan support. Why is that, and what's allowed it to happen over the past 4 years, where there have been typically other environmental rollbacks, but carbon capture technology has gotten the support from the current administration?
Well, I think that everybody in industry and in labor both understand the necessity of reducing the carbon footprint and the emissions footprint of the products that we produce. And it's pretty clear when you look at the technology projections going forward, there are certain hard to decarbonize sectors, and carbon capture fits. The second thing is, it's really important to note the difference between keeping fuels in the ground versus keeping carbon and other emissions out of the air. The job of reducing emissions means that it means cutting emissions. So there are a lot of sectors that produce fuel. There are a lot of sectors that use fuel that want to do it in a responsible manner. And I think carbon capture is one of the technologies that bridges across all those concerns. So that's why there's bipartisan support. The science is pretty good on this.
Right. Just going to discussion, Jamie, there's a question here around capital costs. The process of capture involves filtering the air to be able to, or the flue gas to be able to only pull out carbon dioxide from it. And once you separate the gases, then you have to compress them and transport them and inject them underground. The question here is, which of those aspects is the most capital intensive aspect? And where can cost declines come from the best?
So from what we've seen so far, the most capitally intensive part of it is actually building the capture plant. So that is where we are seeing the highest cost. The compression is a smaller fraction of that. Perhaps the compression and transport, again, depending on how far you transport it, I would say are a quarter of the cost of that. Preliminarily on the facility that we're looking at in Portland, it will be in Portland, Colorado. $300 million is the initial cost that we're looking at just for the capture plant right now. So again, it's very high cost currently with no price on carbon, with little payback from that perspective. So I think you'll start to see also, if we see a price on carbon, that people start to move and there start to be more, I guess, a interest in capturing carbon overall and the technology.
And a question back to Brad. One of the reasons, as Jamie pointed out, the reason that carbon capture technology hasn't particularly taken off is there are no incentives. So, of course, carbon price would be one way in which you could bring in incentive. There is the tax credit that we talked about, which goes some way but doesn't go all the way in meeting the costs of carbon capture. What else can be done if it's not carbon pricing and if it's not a tax credit to be able to create the economic incentives for carbon capture technology to take off?
Well, as somebody who doesn't run a company but has done a lot of bargaining, maybe I'm not the best person, but here's my shot at that. The first thing is we need to pour a lot more money into technology development. And as Jamie was saying, not every flue stream is the same, right? So what's going to work for a steel mill is not going to work for her facilities. And so we really need to drill down on the specific facilities and making sure that we've got the research to help dial the engineering in. We'll see what happens with respect to how we can bring the cost down. I think that we're in the early stages, as Steve was mentioning, that it just makes a lot of sense that the cost curves are going to be pretty steep in the next 5, 10, 15 years. I think the other thing is we really have to think about, if you're a company and you want to put the money into this, how are you competing other calls when you go to the capital committee and say, hey, I want to spend $300 million out there in Colorado, and they say, hey, what about this other competitive thing? So we really have to be quite thoughtful about how we're helping companies finance this and making sure that it fits into their business plan so that they can keep doing the things they need to do to be competitive as we're bringing emissions down.
And Steve, do you want to pitch in with what can be done to incentivize?
Sure. I mean, I'll give a couple of examples. One example that leads directly to this plant behind me here is the low carbon fuel standard that's implemented in California, Oregon. We have one in British Columbia, where I'm based as well. What the low carbon fuel standard does is it sets a regulatory market where there is a requirement specified by government for the carbon intensity of fuel to drop as time goes by for obvious climate benefits. And then the fuel standard sets up a market between regulated parties, the ones that have to be producing fuel and hence have to decarbonize, and the ones that have solutions. And then what happens is the funding goes to the most effective solution. And that way the market establishes the price. So the low carbon fuel standard, I think, has been very successful in reducing the carbon footprint of fuel in California, as well as enabling technologies like ours to get to market. The second example I want to give is around the regulatory and the climate risk perspective. So you're starting to see a movement, I was just on a call with the UK this morning, around the risk that companies face from climate change. And the risk that any company faces is fundamentally twofold. The first is, if climate change materializes, what's the impact to your business? And then the second risk is, if you are required to get to net zero and eliminate all your emissions, what's the financial impact on you as a company? And by raising the awareness of those two issues, I think you're going to start to see more companies realize that from a shareholder perspective, from a customer perspective, that the risks associated with climate change weigh on their market profile, and hence action is taken. And that happens all the time in many, many other sectors of the economy. And I think we're going to start to see that trend emerge over time.
A question for Colin. One of the things that conservation groups are perhaps more attuned to, in a way, are because of your membership. You have people who deeply, deeply care about nature and environment. Have you seen any change in your membership in understanding the issues that we face and the solutions that need to be applied, including carbon capture, for example?
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question. And I do think there's an evolution, right? And we're seeing this in the nuclear space, for example, where obviously, huge fights in the 70s and early 80s. And, folks are now trying to keep plants online in some cases because they don't want to have the clean power displaced or kind of replaced by, nuclear, or sorry, by natural gas or some other or fossil-based system. And I think there's just a greater awareness of the industrial sector as a whole. Look, I mean, the impacts that we're seeing are so much are accelerating at a rate that I think even some of the models wouldn't have predicted, right? I mean, the rates of fire, the rates of the intensity of some of the hurricanes, and so the urgency of acting quickly, I think, is forcing a broader conversation about solutions on many fronts. And this gets back to your previous question on the policies. And I think one of the reasons that these are areas that are bipartisan is that as we're facing these kind of four interrelated crises right now, the climate crisis, kind of the economic crisis, the social justice crisis, as well as the pandemic, investments that actually strengthen our economy, improve public health, address the climate crisis, and create good middle-class jobs are going to be very attractive. And that's where, I mean, I'd like to move beyond the conversation we've been having. I've been trying to do this with my members about, it being more of a, either regulation or tax credit model. Like we're going to need some direct investment. We're going to need to see, folks investing in facilities directly, investing in the R&D, as many have talked about. I'd like to see procurement standards in place very quickly, so folks make the investments. They have a guaranteed market to sell into, whether that's just the Pentagon alone. I mean, could help drive huge amounts of technology. And again, this is a very U.S. answer, but we've had incentives in the past for renewable energy facilities, making sure these facilities qualify for that. I just think there is no silver bullet, but we're seeing kind of this buckshot approach. I'd like to see more money behind all of it, but the fact you had the House-led Democratic majority include a lot of CCUS technology investment proposals in their infrastructure package, and you also saw a huge focus on industrial emission focused technologies in the Senate Republican-led energy package, just shows this is one of those areas that in a city that can't necessarily even agree whether the sky is blue or green on a given day, that this is an area that can bring people together. And I think our members are very supportive of solutions that have that level of support that can frankly get done, because after so many false starts on so many fronts and wasting 4 years of inaction, now is the time to bring people together and do big things again.
Thanks. I'm going to remind the audience that in a few minutes I'll take your question and answers. So if you have them, there's a little Q&A box if you're watching on Zoom that you can use to send in your questions, and I'll try and get to them as soon as I can. A sort of a simple question for Steve. Where will you bury the carbon emissions that you will be offsetting for Shopify?
So Shopify is supporting our facility in British Columbia, Canada. British Columbia is not a great place to sequester CO2 underground, especially where we are, which is in beautiful Squamish. We're in an earthquake zone. So, I talked earlier on about how important permanence and safety is when you look at sequestration of CO2. So our plant in Permian Basin, of course, will bury into existing geological structures. What we're going to do with our relationship with Shopify is we'll use the concrete sector. So we're working with some of the companies, like, for example, Carbon Cure is another Canadian company that sequesters CO2 into concrete. So I think that will be the most likely route that we take.
Got it. And then a question for Jamie. What is your scale-up plan between now and 2030? You mentioned $300 million. I know, when will the investment decision be made, and what is required to get there?
So we're in the middle of the scoping study now for the project. We hope by next year we will be complete to know exactly, to be able to have the full engineering and ready to go. The plan on that one would be to be up and running by 2024. And then that's one plant. We have 13 more. So currently we're actively looking at 2 of our other facilities to do similar type things. So, and then we'll roll into all of the plants as we move along. And, the hope is that the technology will be there to allow us to continue to roll this out at every facility over time.
Great. Another question is that, and any one of you can take this one, is that emissions in rich countries, despite some of the rollbacks we've seen in the US, have been falling for a number of reasons. There's growth in renewables that's happening fast. There's movement to natural gas from coal that has helped much of the reductions in emission. In developing countries, in India and China specifically, those emissions are going up and will continue to go up. They don't have the sort of historical burden that rich countries do, and so they have the room to be able to grow those emissions. But if these technologies scale up and the cost can be brought down, those emissions don't have to come through at quite the pace that they are. So what is it that the US can do, or what can rich countries do to make sure that these technologies become affordable and then are actually not just used in the US, but then used or at least partnered with globally, so that now what are cement and steel factories in China or India can also make use of them?
Well, I'll start. I think the first thing is that when you look at the Paris Agreement and you look at the commitments that were made for the Green Climate Fund, it's really important that developed countries are fulfilling their commitment to make sure that developing countries, and China's kind of a split case there, because they really do a fantastic job on industrial policy and on supporting the development of technologies. But say India as another case, or other medium or low income countries, we need to make sure that we're spending the money to drive the cost of the technology and the availability and applicability of the technology down for the cost and up for the applicability, so that it is available. So as these economies develop, they can take advantage of them, because they still need to solve poverty. They still have very, very large parts of the world where people are in energy poverty. And we really have to step up and make sure that we're developing the technology. And the labor movement here is really hopeful that we can take the lead on developing carbon capture technology, on direct capture technology, and create those jobs here and start to export it. And then eventually they'll take hold all over the world. But it really, really is incumbent upon us to try and lead the pack when it comes to getting these technologies to market.
I'd like to suggest a slightly different model, Akshat, to build on what Brad said. I would like to see the carbon business go in the direction of the energy business, by which I mean you have exporters of negative emissions and carbon credits. Here in the United States, we have a huge capacity to put CO2 back underground again. And just as we've exported energy and fuel around the world, I don't see any reason why we can't do the same with carbon credits. There are many, many countries, Japan, Germany, that have significant carbon footprints and don't have sequestration capability. They don't have the geology. So let's establish a trading mechanism where we can bury CO2 in countries like the United States, Canada, and then offer those carbon credits elsewhere. That will create a huge industry in the 21st century, employ many, many people across the country, and solve the global climate problem.
And the only thing I would add is that I think equity has to be at the center of this conversation in a real way, because I do think that we're gonna have to relook at all trade agreements and making sure that kind of carbon standards are built into agreements across the kind of the global north. But I mean, we do have a responsibility to be helping in the global south, making sure that facilities receive technology ideally invented in the U.S. And doing it in a way that's fair to American workers though too, and American taxpayers that are going to be investing in the technologies, or European investors. I want as many jobs here, but I also don't want this to be ravaging economies that are already struggling, that have been exploited for the resources for years, where they're being punished and not able to compete because we're not willing to make those investments. This gets back to the financing commitments others have referenced, but I do think that we're going to need two sets of trade agreements. One with kind of the G20 plus versus the rest of the world.
Another question is around the sort of guarantee that once sequestration happens, and maybe Steve, you can take this one, that yes, this goes deep in underground. Yes, this goes into the place where carbon came from, and yet it is something that we are injecting in. What at a governmental level needs to be done to ensure that sequestration happens and is monitored and stays there and sort of gives the people a peace of mind that this technology actually works and will deliver the carbon savings it's promising, which is a problem we've had, as you pointed out, on other offsets, say forest offsets, where we don't always know if the carbon has been stored and stored for a certain amount of time.
Yeah, so I mean, firstly, it's worth remembering that CO2 has been safely put underground as part of a process called enhanced oil recovery, which is a mechanism that is used in many locations in the US to produce crude today. In that you compress your CO2 into a liquid and you inject it into existing geological formations and free crude. So the process for putting CO2 underground, measured through gauges, you literally measure the amount of CO2 as it passes through and goes underground. That's an established existing technology for 50 years. Again, you don't do this in an earthquake zone. You do it in a location that's geologically stable, which gives you that assurance. And then there are government standards that are emerging at both the state and the federal level around permanence and around the safety and auditing guarantees required. So I think this sector will continue to mature, but this isn't a brand new idea. It's not CO2 being put into a location where it can easily leak back out. This is a very stable, established technology that's been around for many years.
And perhaps one other point worth addressing is that one of the reasons why this technology has been more controversial is because of its association with oil companies that have not in the past been allies of climate change, or have in a recent investigative piece from Inside Climate News found that ExxonMobil has been lobbying, for example, to roll back regulations on monitoring and verifying these carbon emissions. I also understand there's a whole other slew of industries and companies that have been wanting for these regulations to be stronger. Your company, Carbon Engineering, is with Occidental Petroleum, which has asked for these regulations to be stronger. And so how does that factor into your decision making when when partnering with a company that is aligned as it should be on climate change?
Yeah, I mean, sure it has. We chose our partners and investors carefully, and I'm very, very happy with the actions of Occidental. They're demonstrating to us every single day that they see opportunity in addressing climate change and not just threat to their existing business model. And also you have to remember, we capture CO2. Your previous question was focused on how do we know it's safe to put it underground? Well, the very people that have those skills, the companies that have that knowledge, they happen to be employed in the oil and gas sector today, but they're the individuals who have that skill. So we needed a partner like that to help us safely put the CO2 underground again. And Occidental, for us, have been an absolutely tremendous partner. No complaints at all.
A question for Brad. I think you answered this in some way, but maybe you can expand upon it, which is, would you be supportive of legislation asking Congress to ensure more spending on development of industrial decarbonization?
Yes, 100%. I don't. Thank you for whoever said that question. I don't think there's a more public good than a clean environment, than stopping the worst effects of climate change, right? So this is naturally something that we expect the government to step up on. We expect the government to put these technologies into position where they can be picked up by companies and put into the market where they can be cost effective. And one of the things we know that happens, you get this valley of death everybody talks about. There are a lot of, solutions around getting through the valley of death. But once we get the technology to the place where it's going to be a winner in the marketplace, that change will happen faster than you ever thought it could.
A question for Jamie. So how do you prioritize the type of carbon capture technology you would use in building or in choosing to scale up? Maybe walk through the sort of steps that are needed to understand whether it's Svante or maybe some other company's carbon capture technology. How do you make that choice?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, scale is important to us, right? So many of our plants, you're looking at capturing between 4,000 tons per day up to maybe 10 from one of our large plants, or the plant I'm at today. So being able to actually handle the scale is important. Economics, obviously the cost of it, but also as we're finding and we're digging into some of the technology out there, there's a very large energy draw on the plant itself. On the carbon capture unit, actually more than double what our current facilities are. So being able to either have access to renewable energy, right? It just doesn't make sense to take a lot of energy on just to capture carbon if you're going to be burning more fossil fuels to make that happen. So access to renewable energy or a lot less energy intensive is something that we're looking at. So in the end, it's scale, it's economy, it's really serving the purpose that it can, and that it's not actually causing more CO2 into the atmosphere by operation, and overall, I guess, capital intensive. And as you look at anything, as you're looking to build something, you want it to operate efficiently, right? So
yeah.
Things, I guess.
And a follow-up question there. This is sort of something that Steve addressed, but I think the audience needs a little more assurance on here on storage. So the question is, who takes accountability for potential risks associated with sequestration? Specifically, will governments take this up many decades? Because once you store it, you're going to have to keep it for hundreds of years. Because commercial entities may or may not survive. Of course, Lafarge-Holcim has a long history, but you're not going to be the only company that sequesters. There'd be other companies that may come and go. So how do you give reassurance to people or have systems in place to ensure that the sequestration is permanent?
I think a lot of that comes with experience and R&D and continuing to work with the right partners to make sure that, we are putting in the right places. And it was mentioned earlier that, putting CO2 back into the ground is not something new, right? We've been doing it for years and years. So I don't think it's something that should be doubted and that it will work, or we should question whether or not it's going to somehow be re-released into the atmosphere. So I think that there's some comfort in that. I think, we will always question long-term if it is the right thing, but, in the end, I believe that this is, again, technology that has mostly been developed, but we can always get better at.
And my view on that is you'll get government regulations and government approvals of this type of mechanism. Just as we have standards for example, water treatment, we're going to have standards for putting CO2 underground. And they will be certified by government officials. Where the economic risk sits is a different question, but I think fundamentally you have to look at government people to say, here are the standards, here are the regulatories.
And a question again for you, Steve. What is your projection for further reduction in cost of direct air capture, and over what timeline?
Yeah, so I always get asked this question. I always think it's a little unfair because people seem to pick on direct air capture people and ask this question all the time. We look at costs in two ways. First of all, we look at the experience of building things. And the more you build something, the easier it gets every time. The procedures to build, the supply chain associated with that drops. And that is a large part of the reason why, for example, the costs of solar have dropped. But the second point is the key parameters involved with the technology, the percentage of CO2 you capture as the air passes through the initial filter. So we have a very rigorous campaign inside our company in our facility in British Columbia, where we are testing the next generation of improvements, both incremental and revolutionary. So to sum all of that up, we have a cost down model that we have a high degree of confidence in. That's been the subject of due diligence from many external parties. which gets us to a cost point about half of where we are today. And that cost point is, I'm not going to give specific dollars, but it is substantially cheaper than many of the other abatement mechanisms to stop CO2 at source. And remember also, with direct air capture, you don't have to build pipelines. You don't have that additional requirement to transport from a point source all the way to an end source. So I know I haven't answered your question directly. I rarely do when people ask it, but hopefully that gives you insight. We do expect to come down that cost curve in the same way that other industries do.
Thanks. A question that maybe perhaps Brad can take this one. So over the summer, there was the case of Petronova, which is a coal power plant that captures emissions that was mothballed because oil prices fell so much that the way it was making money was it was pumping carbon into the ground to help enhance the recovery of oil from a field. The question here is, could you address your concerns about the economics of carbon capture in the industrial sector, given what happened at Petronova?
Well, thank you, Akshat, for pushing that toward me. The first thing to know is that Petronova, they had a certain business case. It was built on a price of oil and what the carbon would do to increase the stored carbon would do to increase oil revenues. Price of oil fell, and that business case became more and more difficult. They decided to shut it off. That's not surprising. Going back to my early answer about technology and about bringing the cost down, I'm not concerned about what the cost of long-term CCS is going to be for industry, because the cost curves are in a very favorable place and we will get the cost down. The value that is provided by avoiding those carbon emissions to the public and to the environment is very, very high. So we have to balance what those costs are now with the realization that there's not a single technology really in the history of human economics where the cost has not come down and we don't figure out these science and engineering problems. The really thing, back in the day, for those of us that were in manufacturing, Dr. Deming was a thing. And you cannot do business on the price tag alone. You have to really understand the value of what you're doing. And the value proposition of avoiding the worst effects of climate change is very, very good.
Thanks. A question, maybe Colin, you can take this one. How does man-made carbon capture, which is what we are talking about here, compare with natural-based, natural carbon capture, which is mostly trees, but there are some other nature-based solutions that you can use. Maybe give the audience a flavor of what those methods are, and how do you see them?
Sure, no, thank you for the question. I apologize if my 3-year-old is screaming in the background, so I apologize for the chaos. They're very much working at home right now. Look, natural solutions need to be complementary to technological solutions. And, we think that, as much as 20% of kind of US emissions and maybe as much as 25 to 30% of global emissions could be sequestered through natural systems. Obviously, a lot of that is forestry, but there's huge opportunities in grasslands and wetland restoration, in improved soil practices when it comes to agriculture, basically improved working land opportunities. The amount of investment at this point, right, it's actually cheaper in many cases to do natural solutions. You still have the same issues that I think Stephen over here mentioned about kind of permanence and additionality, and making sure that we are kind of increasing the overall amount. We spend a lot of time really thinking about how to make sure that we're doing things in ecologically smart ways. I don't want a whole bunch of farm fields with a bunch of monoculture trees on them that aren't going to provide habitat and have any other value. And so, I think the natural side should be more of a frame of optimization of natural climate solutions. But, frankly, around the globe, if at scale, right? If you had, solid investments in CCUS, as well as big investments in the natural climate solutions, that could be 30, 40+% of the overall equation. At which point now, we're not even talking about net zero, you're pitching a net negative type global environment in the long term. And so I just want to kind of, I don't know if any of my colleagues are on the line today. These aren't competing. We need both, and we need both to scale. We need incentives for both. This is where Steve's point out markets are important. I mean, I want folks, if they can invest in, in carbon removal through trees, to be able to do that. If they want to invest in technology, they can do that as well, because frankly, we're going to need absolutely all of it to meet the targets that we have.
So we're coming to the close of our hour now, and I'm going to try and again ask you one question. Keep it as short an answer as you can. What's been the one or maybe the most positive development in relation to what we've been talking, specific to your background? And maybe we can start with Jamie. What's been the most positive thing that's happened on carbon capture and cement in the last few years?
Well, from our perspective, I would say the interest in it. So I think we have more people than ever, trying to come to us with new technologies and speak to us about it, and also funding for it as well. So I think there's, investment that will happen in it in the future. So exciting for me to see that there's actually a future in net zero for an industry that's difficult to abate.
And Brad, what do you think has been the most positive thing that's happened with labor and carbon capture?
The thing that I am most thankful for is the continuing documentation and support from the IPCC about the necessity of carbon capture. We work, in the AFL-CIO, where the labor movement's broadly part of the progressive movement in this country, and so those are the discussions that we have to have. And I just have been rereading the 1.5 report over the last couple of weeks. And, the evidence is robust and the agreement is high on the need for carbon capture in the power sector and in the industrial sector. So that's been very, very gratifying for me to see that the science is backing up the need for CCS.
And Steve?
I think it's two things. Public awareness, backed by that scientific data as Brad describes. I think is critical. The other thing for us is the growing recognition that removing CO2 from the atmosphere is going to be needed, but it's also viable. And I like to say 1 ± -1 is also 0. If we can't find a way to stop every emission, then let's pull CO2 back down again. And there's growing recognition and policy support for that. That would be my response.
And Colin?
Yeah, I think I would say the politics, and I don't get to say that very often. I mean, in my world, the politics have been pretty brutal for a while. But this is an area where there is true bipartisanship, and folks that can't agree on anything right now agree that investments in advanced technologies are going to solve multiple goals, and not just reduce carbon pollution, but also find ways to reduce criteria pollution, and really lift up communities and create jobs. There aren't that many unicorns that are kind of floating around the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House right now, and this is one of them. And so we got to make things better. We need refundability and transferability and more investment, and there's a lot of things we need to do. But that base of support is not there for a lot of other solutions right now. And if we don't seize that moment, we will have missed it, because right now this is truly one of the most bipartisan opportunities to make progress in the near term.
Well, thank you very much. We've probably all done these Zoom panels for a while. One of the things that I miss the most, and I think this is probably more like mostly for the expertise that all the panelists have brought to, is an applause. So I'm gonna, but maybe you can imagine one. Thank you very much for your insight, and I hope the audience found the Q&A session very useful. And thanks to Carbon Capture Coalition for putting this together.